Grok AI was asked who built Göbekli Tepe. The answer rewrites human history. There is a hill in southeastern Turkey that should not exist the way it exists. Bury a temple under 12,000 years of dirt, dig it back up, and you expect ruins, crumbling, uncertain, half-guessed. Instead, archaeologists found stone pillars standing 18 feet tall, carved with foxes and vultures and scorpions in lines so clean they look machined. And the people who supposedly built it had no metal tools, no wheels, no writing, and no farms. They were hunter-gatherers. So we asked a simple question and let an AI chew on it alongside the real archaeological record. If you strip away everything we assume about primitive people, what does this place actually tell you? The answer isn't a conspiracy. It's stranger than that. It's the truth, and the truth is already strange enough. Let's start with what is actually verifiably true, because Göbekli Tepe does not need embellishment to be one of the most important places on Earth. In the summer of 1994, a Kurdish shepherd was walking his flock across a dry limestone ridge near the city of Sanliurfa, close to the Syrian border. He noticed a slab poking out of the ground with an edge too flat, too regular, to be natural. Word of it reached a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who had been searching this region for exactly this kind of anomaly. A survey team back in the 1960s had already walked over this hill and dismissed the broken stone as a medieval graveyard, noting only some worked flint and a few limestone slabs assumed to be grave markers from a far more recent burial ground. Schmidt looked closer and realized the earlier survey had missed something enormous. Those flat stones weren't headstones at all. He began digging in 1995 and would spend the rest of his life on that hill, dying in 2014 with the site still nowhere near fully excavated. Even now, most estimates suggest a large majority of the total complex remains buried, which means everything we think we know today is based on only a fraction of what's actually sitting under that ridge. Schmidt's own interpretation, built up over nearly 2 decades of digging, was that Göbekli Tepe functioned mainly as a ritual and gathering center rather than a place anyone lived in permanently. He found little evidence of ordinary daily life in the earliest layers. No household hearths, no domestic trash, nothing that looks like a settled village. What he did find were large carved stone basins that may have been used for communal feasting, along with enormous numbers of wild animal bones, hinting at big, occasional gatherings rather than year-round habitation. His theory, still influential today, was that Göbekli Tepe may have pulled scattered hunter-gatherer bands together periodically for shared ritual, and that the sheer logistics of feeding those crowds during construction and ceremonies may have nudged nearby communities toward deliberately managing wild cereals, an early push toward the farming that would fully take hold in this same region not long afterward. What came out of the ground was not a graveyard. It was a complex of massive stone rings, more than 20 of them identified so far, with ground-penetrating radar suggesting many more still buried. Each ring is built from carved limestone pillars shaped like a capital letter T, and at the center of most rings stand 2 larger pillars, some reaching over 5 meters in height. These aren't rough boulders. Low-relief carvings run across their surfaces: foxes, boars, snakes, cranes, scorpions, vultures, cut with a steadiness that speaks of real skill. And on some of the central pillars, if you look at the sides, you find arms,
bent elbows,
long fingers reaching around the front of the stone toward what looks like a carved belt. These pillars aren't just architecture. They're bodies. Abstract, faceless human figures, standing in a circle, arms folded, as if watching whatever ritual happened inside. The imagery itself is worth sitting with for a moment, because it isn't random. Certain animals show up again and again across different pillars, foxes and snakes especially, while others appear only once or twice, in specific spots. Some researchers have suggested this repetition might mark territorial or clan symbols, almost like an early form of heraldry, with different groups contributing different pillars carved with their own associated creatures. Others read the imagery as more purely spiritual, tied to a worldview in which dangerous, wild animals, predators, venomous creatures, scavengers, held a kind of protective or threshold significance, standing guard at the boundary between the human circle and the world outside it. No one has fully cracked what the animals meant to the people who carved them, and that's an honest gap in the research, not a hidden secret. What is clear is that this wasn't casual decoration. The consistency of style, the recurring figures, and the careful placement all suggest a shared symbolic vocabulary that the builders understood and expected each other to recognize, even if we, 11,500 years later, can only guess at the rules. Then come the radiocarbon dates, and this is the part that actually broke the old timeline. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe date to roughly 9,600 BCE, about 11,500 years ago. That is around 6,000 years before Stonehenge and roughly 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. When these stones went up, agriculture, as we understand it, hadn't been invented yet in this region. There was no pottery, no domesticated animals to help haul stone, no metal tools of any kind. Everything here was cut and shaped with flint, chert, and raw effort. According to the textbook picture of this era, the people living here should have been small, mobile bands moving with the seasons, not organizers of a multi-generational building project involving stones that, by some estimates, weigh in the range of 10 to 16 tons apiece, with some unfinished blocks still sitting in the nearby quarry, suggesting builders were attempting even larger ones. That's the honest problem at the center of Göbekli Tepe, and it's a real one, not a manufactured mystery. Moving multi-ton stone blocks up a hillside without draft animals or wheels takes serious coordination, enough people fed, housed, and organized long enough to finish the job. Archaeologists estimate crews of a few hundred people at a time were needed just to quarry and haul the largest pillars into place. That kind of organized labor, sustained over years, is something we used to associate with early farming societies with surplus food and settled hierarchies, not with roaming hunters. Göbekli Tepe forced historians to rethink the old assumption that farming came first and religion or ritual came later, as a product of settled life. Here, it looks like large-scale gathering and monument building may have come first, and the food-producing revolution followed close behind, possibly even because of the demands of feeding the people who came to build and worship. And then there's the burial. At some point, centuries after the earliest rings were built, the people using this site did something almost harder to explain than the construction itself. They filled it in, deliberately. Tons of rubble, broken stone, and soil were carried in and packed around the pillars until the entire complex disappeared under an artificial hill, the same hill that gives the site its modern name, Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill. Why bury something you spent generations building? Nobody has a fully satisfying answer. Some researchers think it was ritual closure, a way of retiring a sacred space the way older cultures sometimes decommission temples. Others think later phases of the site were reused and simply built over as older rings fell out of active use. Either way, that burial is arguably the reason Göbekli Tepe survived at all, sealed and protected for 10,000 years until a shepherd's flock wandered over it. Now here's where I want to be careful with you, because there's a version of this story spreading online that goes much further than the evidence does, and I don't want to hand you something that sounds true just because it sounds exciting. You may have seen claims that an AI system was fed decades of scans from Göbekli Tepe and independently decoded a hidden star map, complete with a precise date for a comet strike, a lost writing system, and a buried network of libraries spread across a dozen sites. It's a great story. It is not a documented, verified event. I looked for the source of that claim, and there isn't a credible research paper, an academic press release, or a named research team behind it. It appears to be speculative content that got repeated as fact. So, let's not do that here. Let's talk about what's actually being debated by real archaeologists and astronomers, because it's genuinely interesting on its own. There is one real, published hypothesis that gets misquoted a lot, and it deserves a fair hearing. In 2017, a University of Edinburgh engineer named Martin Sweatman published a paper arguing that the carvings on one particular pillar, known as Pillar 43, or the Vulture Stone, might represent constellations rather than purely symbolic animals. His argument was that certain figures on the stone, when matched against software reconstructions of the ancient night sky, lined up with star patterns visible around 10,950 BCE, close to the beginning of a cold snap called the Younger Dryas. He proposed the carving might be marking the memory of a comet impact or airburst event around that time, an event some other scientists, completely independently, have also proposed as a possible trigger for the abrupt climate cooling that hit the northern hemisphere near the end of the last ice age. I want to be straight with you about the status of that idea. It is real, it was peer-reviewed, and it is seriously disputed. Other archaeologists have pushed back hard, arguing that matching carved animals to modern constellation boundaries is deeply subjective. Humans are extremely good at finding patterns we want to find, especially in ambiguous art from a culture that left us no accompanying text to explain its own symbols. Critics have also pointed out that the specific grouping of stars into the shapes we call constellations today is a modern convention. There's no proof the Göbekli Tepe builders divided the sky the same way we do, which makes matching a carved fox or scorpion to a correct region of sky a much shakier exercise than it first sounds. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis itself, separate from Göbekli Tepe entirely, has also been debated for well over a decade among geologists and climate scientists. Proponents point to a thin layer found at multiple sites worldwide containing unusual materials some interpret as impact debris. Skeptics argue those same materials can form through ordinary processes and that ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, some of the most detailed climate records we have, don't show the clear signature you'd expect from a major cosmic impact at that exact moment. Both sides have published extensively, and as of now there's no scientific consensus either way. So the honest way to describe Pillar 43 is this: it's a real carving. It's genuinely intriguing. A specific scientist has proposed a specific and testable interpretation of it, and the wider scientific community has not accepted that interpretation as settled fact. That's not a cover-up. That's just what science looks like while it's still being argued out, in public, in journals anyone can read. What nobody disputes, though, is the precision problem, and this one might actually be the strangest part of the whole site. If Göbekli Tepe were the beginning of a new tradition, the first attempt by inexperienced people to work stone at this scale, you'd expect the earliest work to be the roughest, with skill improving over time as later generations learned from earlier mistakes. That is not what the layers show. The oldest, deepest rings at Göbekli Tepe contain some of the most carefully finished and largest pillars at the entire site. Later phases, built centuries afterward, generally use smaller stones, simpler layouts, and less elaborate carving. The best work sits at the bottom of the timeline, not the top. Archaeologists have noted this pattern for years without a fully agreed explanation. It could mean the builders had already been practicing some kind of stoneworking tradition somewhere else, in places we simply haven't found yet, or that haven't survived. It could mean the earliest rings were the most heavily resourced because they were the newest and most important religious focus of their community, with later generations investing less as priorities shifted. It's an open question, and open question is a very different thing from a race civilization. So, where does that leave us? Not with a lost super-civilization or a machine-decoded prophecy, but with something almost more remarkable. Real hunter-gatherers, 20 generations before the first farm we know of, coordinating hundreds of people across years to raise and carve stones heavier than a school bus, using nothing but flint, muscle, rope, and time. They organized labor at a scale we used to think required agriculture first. They may have watched the sky closely enough to encode some memory of it in stone, even if we can't yet prove exactly what they were recording. And at some point, for reasons still argued over in academic journals, they chose to bury what they built rather than let it fall apart in the open, which, 10,000 years later, is the only reason we get to stand in front of it at all. If artificial intelligence has a real role to play here, it isn't inventing dramatic new answers out of thin air. It's genuinely useful for the unglamorous, grinding work real archaeologists are already doing, cross-referencing thousands of carved symbols across pillars to look for statistical patterns humans might miss by eye, helping model what the night sky over this exact ridge looked like 11,000 years ago, or sorting through decades of survey data faster than a small team of researchers ever could alone. That's a genuinely exciting use of the technology. It's just a slower, more careful kind of exciting than the machine cracked the code and revealed the truth they didn't want you to know. The real story doesn't need that ending. A group of Ice Age hunters raised a stone temple bigger than anything built for another 6,000 years, and we're still trying to fully understand why. That's not a cover-up. That's just how far we still have to go. What do you think actually organized hundreds of hunter-gatherers to build something like this thousands of years before farming existed? Tell me in the comments, and tell me which ancient site you want looked at next.